these are a series of quotes that became evident to us as we were thinking about how could we improve the care of the dying in the United States. The first was, in America, the land of the perpetually young, growing older is an embarrassment and dying is a failure. And without question, the concept of dying as a failure is very embedded, and I think you heard this from David Clark, in this sort of postmodern concept of what it is to become old and frail and die. In the United States, clearly the experience of dying had changed over the past decades, with many more people enduring prolonged deaths due to chronic and progressive illness. So this construct of dying as a failure, people living with chronic illness, and a medical culture that, again, you've heard this morning, that I think is a universal construct that has so focused on curing and on prolonging life that it was not supporting patients and their families during one of life's most emphatic phases, death. And so with this culture that we have, we were then confronted also in the United States by the advances in high technology interventions that have both deluded doctors and patients alike into believing that the inevitable can be delayed almost indefinitely. And in a way, these are statements that were made by individuals that we interviewed in thinking about how we might improve the care of the dying. But each of these statements had a rich history and a sociology, and I think David Clark, again, has portrayed this for the world, but it was very much also a uniquely American experience. So the possibilities for gentle closure of life are often overwhelmed by uncontrolled physical pain, excessive financial burden, unresponsive care plans, and emotional isolation. And we learned all of this in the United States in a study that was called the Support Study that was published in 1995 and basically defined how difficult it was to die in the United States, and it was characterized by patients with significant pain, families enduring financial burden, care that was unresponsive to the needs of patients and often incompetent, and emotionally isolating for those. So we saw ourselves in a very significant problem that needed to be addressed. And this led us, as we think about the setting of the United States in the early 90s, we came into it with an extraordinary history. Dan Callahan, among others, has played a major role in the development of bioethics as a field in the United States and in the thinking of the evolution of patients' rights. And in the United States, clearly the evolution of patients' rights and the centrality of autonomy to Americans has been quite incredibly critical in how Americans, again, think of their choices and their care systems. With the rise of bioethics, we saw continuous debates in the 70s and 80s and 90s on the rights of patients, and particularly the rights of patients to refuse care and to have withdrawal of care. We saw the medicalization of death, and we saw death, which had been something that occurred at home, being moved into the hospital. And with the growth of hospitals, we saw death being a major construct, where upwards of 70 to 80% of Americans in 1992 were dying in hospitals. We did have a grassroots effort for the development of hospice care, but it focused only on a selected population of patients, and those were patients who could be identified as dying within 6 months or less. So we did, in fact, have a robust hospice program which focused on a small number of patients. There were a series of publications that engaged the public in the debate about how we care for the dying. One was a book by Derek Humphrey called Final Exit. This book described how you might take control of your own death and basically commit suicide or have someone help you commit suicide. It was widely publicized in the United States. I think it's been widely publicized here in Europe. And it suggested that there were different ways that you could be able to control your own destiny by basically committing suicide. There was the epidemic that was Jack Kevorkian's epidemic, an individual who felt very strongly about physician-assisted suicide and who promoted physician-assisted suicide through a series of more than 50 deaths in which, through a machine that he created, he helped patients die. He achieved national attention, international attention, and brought to the public domain the discussion of how difficult it was to die in the United States, how patients' pain was inadequately treated, how care was poor, and that one's only choice might be for physician-assisted suicide. We had the passage in 1994 of the Oregon Death with Dignity Act, which allowed for physician-assisted suicide in one state. And we then had a series of Supreme Court decision who said there was not a right to physician-assisted suicide, but allowed this state law to continue as a laboratory for looking at these issues of physician-assisted suicide. And then there were two important publications. The first by Timothy Quill, a hospice physician in upstate New York, who aided a patient in death and who basically provided physician-assisted suicide to an individual patient in a state where it was not legal, and published this story in the New England Journal of Medicine, causing an enormous stir in the medical communities of the role of physicians in the care of patients at the end of life. And then in 1995, the publication of a study called the Support Study, which studied more than 10,000 patients over about a 6-year period and demonstrated that basically care of patients at the end of life was incompetent. 50% of those patients with cancer died in significant pain. Their families were financially burdened and some made bankrupt. Patients' advance directives were not attended to or listened to, and communications between doctors and patients were basically ineffective. And it really set forth the difficulties that we as a country were having in how we should care for our dying. And it was in this setting that we had the opportunity to begin a project which was called the Project on Death in America. It was funded by a philanthropist, George Soros. It was part of a project within what's called the Open Society Institute. And its focus was very simply to improve the care of the dying in the United States. And so this was an effort that was a 9-year effort. Approximately $45 million was made available to the project. And it occurred at the same time that another major philanthropist in the country, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, put more than $200 million into improving the care of the dying. So I'm going to tell you just about this project because I think it's an example of how philanthropy, such as the Floriani Foundation, can make a difference. But I think what we've learned, that how we need to gather and gain attention to these issues and engage the public. So let me spend some few minutes on this project. The idea of the project was really that we wanted to provide competent, compassionate care for the dying. So this required that we'd understand the dying experience for patients and families, that we would be able to identify what the existing barriers were to appropriate end-of-life